Can't hear you.
Oh, I'm not sure we got sound.
Oh, there we go. I didn't know that was the universal thing for we can't hear you. Normally it's this, can't hear you. Welcome to the Paper One Exam Clinic, everybody. We are on the big countdown to your first exam, Friday, less than 48 hours away. Panic if you like, but that's still a lot of time to get a lot of revision in, practice some of them exam skills. We've got Laura and we've got Rosie with us tonight. They're going to answer as many questions as we possibly can. Put your questions in the chat. Any that we don't get through tonight, you can contact us either as a comment or as a DM on Instagram, and we'll try and answer everything that we can. You can also watch this back. We're going to go quite fast tonight. If you've still got questions, you can always watch it back, along with our back catalogue of all our other sessions as well. Stick around till the end when we're wrapping up, because we're going to leave you with some top tips, top tip each from us three before we go, and we're going to get cracking straight away. Are we going to start with you, Laura?
Yep, I can start, yep. Okay, so we've got Akila Robin has asked a nice question. Do we need to know the names of the researchers for memory? Let's actually expand that to all topics, because I think we've got a bit of a conversation going in the chat about this. So the key studies, I think someone's already put this in the chat box, the key studies are the ones that are quoted in the wording of the specification. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, you can download the specification from AQA Psychology, so do that. So names of the researchers in the spec you need to know, aim, procedure, finds, conclusion. All other researchers that you've learned, and that'll be quite a lot of studies, I'm sure, that are not quoting the spec, you do not need to necessarily know their names in the exam. However, what you do need to make sure is if you do decide to include a study that's not quoted in the spec in evaluation, for example, which is it's quite common. You need to make sure that the examiner can really identify that it's that study you're talking about, even though you've not put the researcher's name. So something specific about the procedure or the findings or something like this really helps. So it's basically, if you've forgotten the researcher's names, but you really understand and you remember the details of the study, great, still include it. You're going to get credit for that, okay? So hopefully that answers that question. I think someone else, PYGMY Fluff Puff, that's a great name. Do you lose marks
Pygmy
for not
Fluff
using
Puff.
research name? No, you don't. Okay, so just in reply to that, I hope that answers that question. And we're bound to get repeat questions tonight, but hopefully that answers that question for a couple of you asking. So over to Rosie now for a question.
Thank you, Lara. So I've got Tegan Remington, who has asked us, what are you supposed to do with a discuss question? So that's a really good question, Tegan. Discuss is quite a unique sort of command word, because discuss can be used to, if it's asked in a question, it can actually incorporate all of the assessment objectives, so AO1, AO2, and AO3. So I'll give you an example. If you were given a 16-mark question with a little scenario at the top that you may have seen, and the command word is discuss, then you'd be expected to show your AO1, your AO2, and your AO3 sort of within that. If there wasn't a scenario there and it was just kind of, for example, discuss the working memory model, then that is the same as a question that's kind of saying outline and evaluate. So sort of on a more simple kind of 16-mark question, sort of 6 marks of AO1, so knowledge, and then 10 marks of AO3 discussion. So it's quite an unusual command word in that it kind of incorporates all of the assessment objectives with a scenario type essay, but also can just be used as in kind of a more simple way. So I hope that helps, Tegan, helps you to understand kind of what that command word means. And I think the best thing you can do is look at some example questions, and then you'll see those kind of assessment objectives being repeated and hopefully build your confidence in terms of what that means.
Yeah, do you mind if I just add to that a moment, Rosie?
Absolutely not. Go for it. Yeah.
With discuss as well, just to kind of emphasize this, the difference between outline and evaluate and a discuss. Outline and evaluate, you could give just three weaknesses, for example, in your evaluation. With a discuss question, you've got to show and give evidence of both sides of the argument in your AO3, and that's really important. I've definitely seen mark schemes where you'll get capped if you're one-sided. So please remember that a discuss question is ever so slightly different from an outline and evaluate. You've got to, in your evaluation, give both sides of the argument. So, for example, a strength and a weakness, if you like, okay? Okay, so we've got a question here by Jess Pearson. What's the best way to write AO1 for role of the father? It's a really good question. It tends to be a bit of a topic students maybe don't feel so confident on, actually. So there are numerous roles for the father in our specification. I'm sure there are lots more than out the specification, but the two roles that we focus on when we teach it are that the father is just a playmate and not a primary attachment figure. Okay, and the other role of the father is actually, the role of the father is that he can be just as sensitive as the mother, and he can be a primary attachment figure. So that's kind of your knowledge, if you like. You can talk about the knowledge in terms of, this is what the theory says, this is what research has pointed to, and then it really depends what the question is apart from outline. If it's just an outline, that's fine. You might get discuss the role of the father, or outline and evaluate, for example. You might get a STEM. Okay, so it depends on the rest of the wording of the question. But that, in terms of your AO1, are kind of the two roles, the main roles of the role of the father, if you like. So over to you, Rosie.
Thank you, Lara. So Emily YouTube has asked, do we need to know the statistical test formulas to find the calculated values off by heart? Okay, so Emily, first of all, well done. It's good to see that you're kind of prepping your research methods knowledge for paper 1. You don't need to know your statistical test formulas to find the calculated values off by heart. I am assuming when you say calculated values, I'm wondering if you're referring to the critical values values table, and whether or not something has to be kind of more than or less than the critical values in the table. So the only statistical test that you need to be able to calculate the calculated value for is the sign test. So, that could be asked on paper 1. So I would make sure that I know that. But when you are looking for the rule as to whether or not something is significant, it will be underneath the table that you are given. So if you're given a critical values table, it will state, for example, for significance, the calculated value must be equal to or greater than the critical value. You don't need to learn it off by heart. Just look for the rule at the bottom of the table. So I hope that helps, Emily. I hope that's what you were after with your question. Thank you.
Great, cool. So we've got a question here by Georgia May. How do you answer 16/8 marker questions which say discuss research into? For example, I saw a practice 8 marker of discuss research into ultradian rhythms. So really good question. In terms of 8 marker, usually you're looking at 3 plus 5. Not that you need to be concerned with the split of AO1 and AO3, but it's definitely a great guidance to the amount of time you should be spending on each assessment objective. So in other words, you should be spending more time on evaluate. Now with discuss research, the word research, and I say this a lot, so some of you might have heard me say this already, is research can mean theories, explanations, and or studies, or all 3. If it said discuss a research study into this rhythm, then you would outline a study. You'd then evaluate kind of the pros and cons of that study in terms of explaining that rhythm in terms of a discuss question. So I hope that answers your question there. And obviously, like we said with the discuss kind of command word, you're looking at really giving kind of both sides of whether to what degree it can explain ultradian rhythms, okay, and if there's any challenging kind of research for that or not, or maybe the research studies that underpin it are really weak because of a certain methodology or something like that. So I'm going to be really sneaky here, Rosie, and just answer a quick question by Sadie, I think. Has Sadie X, how do you structure 16 markers that have separate AO points with their own AO3 points? I'd need an example for that, but my advice that I would give you, I did a practice question today with someone tutoring, and it was something like discuss the learning theory and Bowlby's monotropic theory, like 16 marks. For that, I would set that out myself as I would structure all, and it was a STEM question as well, by the way. So I would do AO1 learning theory and do the STEM link within it in the AO1. I would do another paragraph of AO1 and AO2, giving Bowlby's monotropic theories, linking the STEM within it. And then I would be doing 2 evaluation points. There's no real right and wrong way. I've generally found when I read students' answers that doing all of the AO1 and AO2 together, or all of the AO1 if there's no AO2, and then the AO3 after, personally works best. It does depend on the question, but I see more questions where that's the likely way to structure it and the better way to structure it. So it's your call, but I would say most of the time, all of AO1 and then AO3 at the end. It also allows you to split your time between the AO1 assessment objective of, let's say, 8 rough minutes if you haven't got a STEM, and then the rest of your time, let's say another 12 minutes or so on AO3. So it allows you to kind of keep a milestone on how long you should be spending on each section. All right, that's me done. Rosie, over to you.
That's all right. Yeah, because some questions pop up when you're answering one and they're kind of linked, aren't they, a little bit? So I'm going to answer a question from Aisha. Aisha has asked, what type of research methods will come up in paper 1? So again, just in case you're not aware, obviously research methods is kind of mainly examined in paper 2, but as we've seen over the years, if you kind of have done your past paper 1s, you will see that every single year there are a proportion of the marks which are available for research methods. In terms of what type of research methods will come up, Aisha, it's really hard for us to kind of sit here and predict it. I would say it's impossible, actually. What I would say is some areas of paper 1 lend themselves really nicely to some areas of research methods. So to give you an example, social influence, obviously a lot of the research that's done in social influence is unethical. So ethics could be something which we may see in paper 1. For example, attachment uses the observation method quite a lot. So we might think, right, we might see some questions on that. Memory, for example, heavily relies on the experimental method. So you can start to think, well, maybe some of those are more likely. However, last year, I think it was, Lara, was it randomization and standardization on paper one? I think possibly, I can't quite remember, but it was something quite small and maybe something not anticipated. So if you're looking at this point, Aisha, and you're really worried and you're thinking, crikey, I've not really looked at very much research methods, think about what lends itself most naturally to paper one. Maybe start there once you've got all your knowledge secure, obviously on the 4 topic areas that are on there. Okay, I hope that helps to answer your question. Sorry, I can't predict it more accurately than that.
Yeah, cool. I've got a question here by Lolly Lake. Do you need to know dates and also percentages in like situational variables, for example? Okay, so dates sometimes comes up. It's a funny one. No, you do not need to memorize dates and years. If you've done that, get rid of that. Let some free memory for other important stuff. You don't need to remember dates. The only time you need to remember a date is if you're going to evaluate it in terms of its temporal or historical validity. In other words, some conformity research has been attempted to be replicated in a more modern day age, and we don't find the same conformity rates. And there's a reason for that. Okay, so you might want to know the year of Ash's study, for example, for that. But for other studies where you're not going to be really taking into account about the historical validity of the time of the study and things like that, no. And that, for the large majority, no, you don't need to remember the dates. In terms of percentages, I'm going to push the boat out here and say, for all variables of experiments, particularly for things like Ash's variations and Milgram's variations, because obviously you're looking at the variations of the study and variables there, I would say you need to know the percentages. And there's not that many percentages to remember, so I would say please get those in your head because they work really well. If you're asked to, outline and evaluate a specific variable, for example, you're going to need to know the finding for that, and that is going to donate to the percentage of that particular variable. Okay, so that's really, really important. And just a really, really quick other one, Abdullah Nasir has asked, what are your predicted 16 marker questions? I'm going to nip this in the bud now because we get questions constantly about this. We even got it in the exam clinics that we've done. And I'm going to say this one more time, and that is, you cannot predict 16-mark questions. You can go and make a really nice snazzy table of all the previous 60 marks that have been asked and then gauge, okay, they've not asked this, I'm going to really concentrate on that. Yeah, if you want to do that, fine. The point is you've got to absolutely revise everything. And I think I've said this time and time again, but I'm going to say it again. And that is that if a particular question previously has not been answered very well in that exam series and the examiners all to get together and they make an examiner report, as you probably all know from AQA, and it's not been answered very well, they could, and they have, they'll ask a similar question, if not maybe the same, the following year until we get it right. And when I say we, that could be us teaching it to you versus, it could be just students are very weak at that topic area and need to revise it better. I don't know. So there is no way to predict the questions. And I hope nobody's sitting here in the room today or anywhere around the UK doing this A-level and thinking, okay, I'm just going to revise this because it's not come up last year. That would be a real shame. Okay, because that's not how AQA work. Okay, and that's just not what you should be doing. Okay, so prepare. Make sure you revise everything. That's me.
Absolutely.
Over to you.
Yeah. Top advice, yeah. I'm going to answer a question from Lucy Abbott. So Lucy Abbott has asked us, for evaluation, can you use general ones such as control, ethics, validity, and reliability? And Lucy, I like how you're thinking here. So I was doing some practice questions with some of my students today in the classroom, and we were talking about role of the father. I can see lots of you guys are interested in that as well. And we were talking about Schaefer and Emerson's study, and they said we can't remember the evaluation. And I said, well, what research methods we use? So if we look at Schaefer and Emerson's, they interviewed the mothers in that study. The children were observed in a naturalistic observation. Can we evaluate that? Yes, we can. Now, what I would say is really, really important is if you are using research methodology, such as those points that you've listed, Lucy. So let's say it was a controlled observation for attachment, and you were thinking, right, okay, so there were really high levels of control. What I would like to see is in your explanation of that evaluation, you are explicitly linking that to the area that you are evaluating. So for example, if we were going to say that there were high levels of control in a controlled observation, high levels of control over what? So, you might say, well, there were high levels of control over other potential distractions for the infant in the room. Okay. And then you can use that to then praise whatever it is you're looking at. So I would say that to begin with. So yes, use it, but be very specific in your explanation. And then secondly, if you are going to criticize a theory, based on the methodology on which it originated. So I'll give you an example. The theory of normative social influence comes from Ash's study. And then you're going to criticize Ash's methodology. At the end, you kind of need to make clear the idea that because there was a problem with the initial methodology, that then could mean that the theory isn't as strong as it could be. So what I wouldn't want to see is if you were doing an explanations essay, you just criticizing Ash's study, because that's not quite right. Okay, you'd need to go back and say, therefore, this could kind of cast doubt on the theory itself, because the theory and the study are kind of connected together. So Lucy, I hope that helps. By all means, rely on the no doubt excellent kind of more general research methods knowledge that you have, but please make sure your explanation is specifically linked to the theory that you are evaluating.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Rosie, for that. So a couple of questions I just want to answer. One quick one, which was, where's it gone? E123, we will be asked main questions, essays about research that are in the spec. Yes, is the short answer to that. You could get asked a 16 marker on, for example, Milgram, on Zimbardo, on Ash, because they are the three theorists that are quoted in the spec for social influence. Okay, and the same for the other spec. If you're not sure about this, I'm not going to sit here and repeat the spec to you. If you Google AQA specification and go on the AQA website, the specification is in full there, and it's in bullet points, so it's really digestible for each topic. It's really easy. You should know what's in the specification, because that's exactly what the exam paper is going to be. If you like, the exam questions are going to come from the spec wording. They can't deviate from that. So that's why it's really important to know the studies that are in it, because you could get asked on the APFC, the aim, procedure, finds, conclusion, of any of those studies in the spec. What is the question that I was going to actually answer was, Emily Lindley, sorry. Can you go over authoritarian personality and how to answer a 16 marker on it? Well, firstly, Emily, yeah, I'm going to go through the AO1 for you and some snazzy evaluation points that you can do, but how to answer a 16 marker on it, I'm not going to be able to help you too much, because it really depends on the wording of the question. Okay, so it might not be a straightforward outline and evaluate. If it is an outline and evaluate, the authoritarian personality, or a discuss, I can definitely help you with that. So authoritarian personality, remember, we need to remember how that's measured. It's measured using the F scale. Okay, first thesis, which is a questionnaire. We can evaluate that already, so that's one evaluation point. In terms of the authoritarian personality, I would say Elms and Milgram is probably the research that comes to mind, but you guys might have learned a slightly different piece of research, and that is fine. In terms of characteristics, we're looking at someone with conventional beliefs, someone who doesn't like ambiguity, someone who's got very kind of right and wrong, black and white, and someone that's obviously willing and able and submissive to obey to someone of a high status, an authoritarian figure, basically. Okay, so with that, and with a lot of theories in your paper one topics, there are countering theories. So when we're talking about evaluating something like the authoritarian personality, we might think, okay, is there a situational explanation of obedience? Which there is. We can think about bringing in the variables, for example. So it might not be dispositional in terms of explaining obedience levels. Actually, it might be something to do with the situation itself. Okay, so there are multiple areas in the specification where you can kind of use one theory to evaluate the other. So another example would be, and we've said it already, learning theory and Bowlby's monotropic theory. They're both saying opposite things, so we can use them to counter-argue each other, and there are lots of opportunities in the specification where you can do that. Another area in memory is the memory models. multi-store and working memory model, for example. Psychopathology, when we're talking about explanations or treatments, they're all coming from a certain perspective, approach. You can evaluate OCD with maybe, behavioral cognitive in terms of therapy. So there are lots of opportunities to do this. It's just being mindful of that, because you've got all the knowledge there. It's just how you're applying it in the exam, isn't it? So over to you, Rosie.
Absolutely. Some top tips there from Lara. So a couple of people have started to ask, and Lara, I'm not sure we have answered this one yet. You correct me if we have, though, about designing a study and if it can come up on paper one. You haven't answered that, have you? Not yet.
I haven't answered it, no.
No. So obviously lots of people that seem very, very worried about this. Safa has asked, Mianka has asked as well. So I'll just kind of mention this now. So design a study, you've no doubt kind of come across when you have been revising, obviously, for paper 2. So when we say design a study, I don't want to kind of freak people out at this point so close to paper 1, but you may have seen kind of a 10 to 12 marker that is sometimes, but not always, asked at the end of paper 2. Now, Safa, to answer your question, we haven't seen kind of a long design a study question on paper 1. So, I think no is the very short answer to your question. However, please remember other areas which kind of come under that sort of broad umbrella, if you like, of designing a study. So, for example, writing some standardized instructions, or writing a consent form, or writing a debrief. Those kind of come under that same broad area of the specification, and they certainly could come up on paper 1. So, for example, writing a consent form or something along those lines. So I wouldn't expect the very large extended answer, 10 to 12 marks, but, writing a consent form is kind of something that we wouldn't be particularly surprised if that kind of popped up. So I hope that helps.
Great, perfect, thank you. So we've got Sami Bashir. How do you know when to note down procedure findings and conclusion in a 16 marker? It's a really good question. If the question has asked you to outline and evaluate a research study, or has said Milgram or Ash or whatever, then obviously you will need to write about the aim, procedure, findings, conclusion in the A01, and then you would evaluate the study, such as the methodology, for example. Depending on what the question's asking, maybe you evaluate just the findings, I don't know, in the A03. However, if you had a question that asked you to outline a theory, okay, let's say one of the, seeing as we've just had a question on it, the authoritarian personality explanation of obedience, and you were going to put a study in AO3 to support or contradict the theory, you would not be writing about the procedure. You would only be including details of the findings, because it's the findings that prop up and demonstrate the theory. You don't need to waste time writing about the procedure. And it's a common mistake, and that's why I wanted to answer this question, Sammy, because it's a common mistake students make in AO3, and when they're using a study to evaluate a theory, they end up, and that's great, the study in detail, but they end up writing about the aim, procedure, everything, and it's not until you get to the last 2 sentences of the paragraph there that's the only bit that's really creditworthy in terms of making sense of evaluating what you've put in AO1. So hopefully that answers your question on that. I did want to answer just another quick question by Pip, because I think maybe this is a question that a lot of you maybe are wanting a bit of clarity on maybe. So Pip said, can you tell us the layout of a 16 marker, please? So the layout of a kind of standard, let's say, outline and evaluate AO1 and AO3 question 16 marker would be, as I said before, you do the AO1 all first, and then you do your AO3. And if you're thinking, oh, I've been taught to do 5 points for AO3, I've been taught 3, I've been taught 2, I'm just going to say what our recommended method is in terms of timing, and considering the quality of what you can write in that time would be 3 evaluation points. Now, that would change slightly if you had a 16 marker that had a STEM, a scenario where you've got to apply. So if it was still outline and evaluate, it was a 16 marker, but it said refer to the conversation above in your answer. So you've got to apply the scenario. The split here of marks, not that you need to know this, but it's good for timing, as I said, 6, 4 and 6. So the AO2 marks have been grabbed from the AO3 part, because usually AO3 is 10 marks. So here the way you'd structure this, and it's a bit like if any of you have been to our Grade Booster or Strong Foundations or really looked at any of our material on how to master AO2, the way you would do this is you'd give some theory in your AO1, and then you'd quote the STEM in a meaningful way and link it with the theory. And you'd do that multiple times. And then you would be doing 2 evaluation points as opposed to 3. Okay? Because you've almost got 10 marks combined for AO1 and AO2. I want you to think of when you're asked to apply something or refer to something in AQA in the exam, what you're really being asked to do is integrate the STEM, the scenario, into your theory. So you're using the theory to explain what's going on. And that's true psychology. That's probably the reason why a lot of you are sitting here and you're doing psychology. You're curious. You want to understand how people work, how they tick, okay? And that's psychology. You're given a behavioural scenario in the exam, and you've got to use all the knowledge that you've been taught in the span of 2 years to apply, to explain that. Okay, so that's the way I want you to see it. I don't want anyone to be thinking, and hopefully you're not doing this, and that is writing AO1 and then doing a separate paragraph and just mentioning a bit of AO2. It should be integrated, and that would make sense if you read the question and the STEM and then start annotating the STEM to all the theory links you can make, and that's your plan. Voila. You've got the links that you're going to make in the STEM with the theory that you're going to use to explain it by. Okay, so hopefully that irons out some creases with structure of extended questions. So back over to you, Rosie.
Thank you, Laura. Okay, we have got a couple of little questions. So Raspberry 101 has asked a couple of times now, and they're obviously quite concerned this, about implications for the economy. Oh, there it is in capitals. So that's a very sort of specific area of research methods. So what I would say to you, Raspberry 101, there are kind of several areas of paper 1 that lend themselves quite nicely to that. So when we're looking at the economy, if you kind of start to think of areas such as the role of the father, for example, so what we mean is if we find that a father can be just as good a caregiver as a mother, for example, such as Field's research, then that could potentially mean that the mother could return to work sooner in order to contribute to the economy. And that could, for example, result in the gender pay gap closing. So a good way to look at this, especially if it's something that's kind of brand new to you, or that you've not really heard about before, is to think, right, when somebody is able to go to work, they are able to pay their taxes and contribute to the economy. Okay, so that is one thing that you can kind of keep coming back to. So for role of the father, mothers are able to return to work and contribute to the economy. For psychopathology, if somebody has been successfully treated for a mental illness, they are able to return to work and contribute to the economy. Okay, so I would say that could be a good thing to have a look at. And if you look at the past paper questions on this area, quite similar things tend to come up on the mark scheme each time. Equally, if you are looking at the psychopathology section, if we can find something which is a highly effective treatment, then that may also be good for the NHS, because that could mean that the NHS is then able to kind of divert resources to caring for people with other types of conditions. Now, if you haven't looked at it before, I would just stick to that kind of core idea of returning to work and contributing to the economy through paying your taxes. Okay, so if you kind of keep it to that level, if you're really, really not sure, obviously we don't want to worry anybody, but there are quite a few past paper questions to have a look at on that area, and you will see the kind of similar themes sort of coming through onto that. Okay, over to you, Lara.
Great, thank you, Rosie. So I've got chilling in clouds here. If my AO3 is in my AO1, would I still get marks for AO1? Yes, you will. It's the examiner's job to kind of tease out the assessment objectives within your work. All I'm saying to you is it makes sense for yourself writing it, and also makes it way easier to mark, to do for an extended question AO1 and then your AO3. But if you've amalgamated it and mixed it all together, we will be obviously marking it as what you've written. Okay, so we'll be spotting the AO1 and the AO3 within your work. So that's absolutely fine. So don't worry about that. Another question I've got is by, sorry if I get this wrong, Thansika Anthony Kingston. What is the difference between elaborate rehearsal, maintenance rehearsal, and prolonged rehearsal? So maintenance rehearsal is, as it says, we're maintaining something in a store, and this is in the short-term memory. So that is a good example of that is if you're, I don't know, if you're on the phone to someone, you've got no pen and paper, and I don't know, you can't put it in on your phone, and someone's giving you a telephone number on the phone, and you've got to remember it, so you can put the phone down and put it into your phone. you might repeat that number in your mind to keep it there for a short time until you've got a pen and paper where you can write it down somewhere. That's like a good example of maintenance rehearsal. We're kind of looping it in our mind and saying it and repeating it. Yeah, it's that articulatory loop. Whereas prolonged / elaborate rehearsal is basically where we think more deeply about the information that's in short term. And by thinking about it more deeply, that is how we get transfer from short term to long term memory. So that's how it gets made into a long term memory. So hopefully that answers your question there. Rosie, back over to you.
Thank you very much. So we've had a question from Eden Craig 6, who has asked, can you get a 16 marker on the behavioural, emotional and cognitive characteristics of phobias, depression and OCD? It says it on the spec. Okay, so the short answer to your question there is no. You are just expected to know those characteristics, much more likely to come up as a short answer question or for something where you have to apply it. So I seem to remember there was a question where you had to outline for somebody with a phobia of wasps, you had to say what the behavioural characteristics of their phobias might be, their emotional characteristics of their phobia. So no, don't worry about evaluating on those. And then I'll answer another question if that's okay with you, Lara, because that one was really short. We've had a question repeated a few times that I don't think we've answered yet from Gion Star X. Don't think we've answered that one, which is, would you write post-event discussion and leading questions in a 16 marker for misleading questions? So if we just bring that one up, it has come up quite a few times. So it might be useful for students to kind of understand. It starts with a J, Gion. So I'll start to answer this question. Oh, there we are. Lovely. Thank you, Laura. So when we're looking, it's misleading information is the wording in the specification, okay? So if you were asked a question on misleading information, that would include leading questions and or post-event discussion. So let's say, for example, it was a 16-mark question on misleading information. Yes, you could write about both of those things within that. And I noticed earlier, Gian, you were asking, what would you write about? Well, hopefully you've learned a key piece of research for each one of these areas. So for example, lots of students for post-event discussion have learned the research study, for example, of Gabbett, and lots of students for leading questions have learned the study about the car sort of crash accident thing, which is Loftus and Palmer's study. So that would, those two studies would kind of form the basis of what you would be looking at within that. But yes, if it's misleading information, you could write about either, but also post-event discussion or leading questions could also specifically be asked about on their own. As well. Okay, so I hope that helps. I know you seem to have a few little questions on that area, but that should kind of give you a broad picture to kind of go away and study from, and hopefully that makes a little bit more sense to you. And thank you for your question. Lara, I'll pass back to you.
So Adam Bransby, we've got, if you use a study for AO3, do you talk about the procedure and findings or just the findings? If you're using the study in your evaluation to support or contradict what you put in AO1, usually you are just going to give the findings because it's the findings that prop up what you're trying to support or contradict. So hopefully that answers that question. What was the other one? A lot of you are asking, can we go over statistical tests? We've got quite a lot of resources on our website because I would refer you to the statistical inferential testing box. We've also got quite a lot of stuff on our Instagram as well. But that is something that will definitely go, like, kind of emphasize a bit more in next week's session for paper 2. But if you need to be reminded of the statistical testing box, then have a look on our website, or maybe Laura can put a link in the chat box here. SJ, you've put, I know on mark schemes it says they can award marks for extra relevant info, but does that happen often? How can they tell whether the extra info is relevant, correct, or just made up? Very good question. Examiners know, they're trained. They're really experienced teachers. So when it says you can award marks for extra relevant info, I just want to say the mark scheme is a guideline that you see on AQA, which is why you probably might find it really difficult to mark your own work or mark a peer's work. It's a guideline. You really need to know your stuff because there might be stuff on the mark scheme that's not there that can be credit worthy. And that's what we mean by that. There's a whole load of information that could be taught for each topic and a whole different variety of studies that can be utilised. Some centres use some studies, other centres use different studies for the same thing. as long as they're not quoted in the spec, we will do that universally. So I think that's what that kind of means, and they know is all I can tell you. Okay, and if they don't know, it's their job to look it up before they mark it, and that's what they do. Okay, it's really obvious if you've made a study up, because, and I've had this a couple of times when I've read answers, because it's so general and blasé, and it's just a kind of, it supports because it shows this and this, the reaction of this and this, which is basically what the theory's about. It's really vague, it's really simple, it's really general. So that's what I'm saying. If you can't remember a researcher's name, as long as the detail and the elaboration that you put in is good and it can be recognized as that study, it's going to be credited. If you write like one sentence of a finding and it's really general, it's probably not going to receive a whole lot of recognition and credit. So that's something to think about. Rosie, back over to you. Rosie's going to answer the last question now, guys. And then we're going to give some tips at the end, so stay for that.
Okay, so Jess Pearson has asked, do you need to know all 7 of Jahoda's mental health criteria, or can you just learn 3? So Jess, I think my advice to you would be, make sure you know Jahoda's criteria. And I'll give you a couple of examples of where learning 3 may have got you in a little bit of a tricky situation. So number 1, I certainly seem to recall somewhere in my memory that there was a multiple choice where you had to recognise Jahoda's criteria. So if you'd have just learnt 3, then you could have potentially put yourself at a little bit of a disadvantage there. And then quite recently, we've seen an application question whereby a scenario may be sort of described to you of somebody who is potentially lacking some of Jahoda's criteria, and that was an application question. So what I'm thinking is, if you only learnt kind of 2 or 3 of Jahoda's criteria, should a question like that come up again, you may be leaving yourself in a position whereby you haven't quite got enough knowledge to sort of learn them. And that's probably why your teacher, well, that will be why your teacher's kind of covered them all in the first place. So you may feel like Jahoda's criteria are overkill. We know that that's an evaluation of Jahoda's criteria, but certainly do make sure that you know those kind of going into the exam. Okay.
Great, perfect. Thank you, Rosie.
What a great session. Absolutely tons of questions there. There's a couple that kept coming through, so I'm just going to put them on very quickly, and I'm going to run through a few, and then I might throw a few to you. Do we need to know the process of minority social influence? Yes, nice quick answer. Not you got to know the minority principles like commitment, consistency, flexibility. Then you've also got to know the social change processes. How do you know which of Bowlby's theories to use? I know exactly what Laura would say. It depends on the wording of that question. Whether they're asking you for maternal deprivation, that's what happens when attachment doesn't form or it's disrupted. And then if it's just about Bowlby's, how does attachment come about? Then we're on to how we explain attachment. A lot of students get those two muddled up. Don't just see the word Bowlby and go for it. It really depends on what you're being asked in that question. Could you be asked a 16 marker on early attachment? Yes, you could. Read it carefully. See whether it says on childhood relationships or adult. I don't know about you two, but I think the question would probably be adult/childhood relationships. The way to evaluate it, think about research, think about what Laura said about counter-arguments, about what Rosie said about the economy. So there's loads you can do here. This question's been asked quite a bit tonight, how we structure it. This type of question, I think what we'll do is address that on Instagram, where we can give you some actual structured suggestions on the evaluation. Everyone here might put loads of different things in the evaluation. We can give you an answer. We'll do that when we get off tonight. Can you use issues and debates for evaluation? Yes, you can. But Laura, what's your tip here?
You should be using it. I would even stretch as far, and I might get told off for saying this, I would even stretch as far as to say, if it's applicable, if you can do 2 issues and debates for a 16 marker, then you only need to really learn one specific evaluation point for that topic area. If you're confident with issues and debates, use them. You can use them to evaluate pretty much everything. So yes.
Yeah, just do it properly. That's the only caveat, isn't it, really? Don't just shove it in. You can't just say everything's reductionist, even though it might be. You're going to have to show some of that knowledge. Rosie, difference between commitment and consistency?
Yeah, so commitment, we are looking for the idea of sort of personal sacrifice. So the minority are kind of making a stand for what they believe in. So let's say they're really passionate about recycling. So for them to sort of show commitment, we'd be looking for them to sort of go out of their way and make that personal sacrifice. So for example, by going and, publicly recycling things in their lunch break or something like that. And that links to the augmentation principle that a couple of people have been asking about. So just the idea that, it really kind of, it's almost like it enlarges the issue in the majority's mind because they see, oh, wow, they're taking it really seriously. They're not doing this for kind of their own personal gain. This is something that we can take quite seriously. And maybe we ought to consider what the minority is saying. The other one on there was consistency. So consistency can be shown in two ways by your minority. Consistency between the members of the minority group themselves, and also consistency about their view on whatever it is over time as well. So that's kind of the difference between them. Hope that helps.
Fab. Yeah, some people have asked about studies. We've posted today on our Instagram a link to a document that we've made which details all the studies that you could use. We've highlighted what's compulsory and named on the spec, like Laura's mentioned tonight, and what's some optional ones that you could. If you feel like you're a bit short for your evaluation, you could go away and find them. Is there possible research methods won't be on paper one? No. Is that a double negative? No, it will be on paper one, definitely.
It will be, yeah.
Laura, institutionalization and its effects. Can you give us a bullet point list?
Institutionalization effects. So we can have things like low IQ. We can have delayed physical development. We could have disinhibited attachments. We can have disorganized attachments. Effects of mental health as well. So any of those effects, basically, there's a wide variety of effects that you can use for institutionalization, and it has definitely come up in AQA a couple of times, that question. It's well worth looking at the mark scheme for that one.
Yeah, fab. And a general list will get you through most questions, really, wouldn't it? Just contextualise it if it's an AO2 question. Do you need to make essay plans? You don't have to, it's not compulsory. We advise you to pause for a minute, read questions several times. An essay plan's good in terms of helping you be selective with what you write, making sure you're interpreting a question accurately. You're not going to lose marks for not making a plan, but it will help. Just like any plan in any other question, it will help. Okay, last two questions. Rosie, can I use Romanian orphanages as a strength of Bowlby's maternal deprivation theory? I'd say yeah.
Can I use Romanian orphanages as a strength for Bowlby's maternal deprivation hypothesis? It's quite a complicated one, that really, isn't it? Because it does show that there are effects, but also obviously the effects can be overcome. And obviously Bowlby's maternal deprivation theory states that any impact of deprivation, i.e. prolonged separation from the maternal figure, is not only inevitable, but it's irreversible. So I would actually use the Romanian orphans to suggest that, it is reversible with sensitive care. So I think this student might be finding it quite tricky because it's hard, this area of the spec, because they do overlap, but really, Romanian orphans and the effects of institutionalization and Bowlby's maternal deprivation, I always say to my students, try and kind of think of them as separate in your mind unless you're really, really confident with them. So that's how I'd use it within that, because it can be overcome, and I'm not really sure how you would link it to the monotropic theory. I think it's more closely linked to maternal deprivation.
And that's where an essay plan might come in handy, mightn't it? Because you can figure out where it's relevant, if you pause for a second. Okay, and before I just tell you what our next sessions are on next week, any final tips, Laura?
Probably the tip. Can I give two tips? Sorry. The first tip is, I say this a lot, and a lot of you are probably just going to listen to me go, yeah, I will, but you won't. Read the question. When I say read the question, I can't even give you a strategy for this, but I mean, definitely underline, highlight. The best strategy, I would say, is I know it seems really silly and simple. Read it at least 3 times. You've got time in the exam to plan and read the question. Just don't read it once, read it twice, 3 times, because often the mistake is, in terms of getting a grade that is unexpected, a lower grade, let's say, is you might recall your paper back, and the biggest mistake is the student has not understood and has not read the question. So pause and spend time doing that. Second thing, evaluation. If you're short on time on evaluation, try and do counter arguments or devil's advocate more. Okay, and then you can kind of lessen the amount of points that you need to discuss. That's me.
Yeah. That's
and
a great tip about reading the question. Don't be that student that writes about work and memory model when the question is about multi-store model. Just don't let that be you. Okay, this year. Rosie, final tip?
I would just say, we've heard research methods mentioned quite a few times tonight. Don't forget that you need to apply your answer to the question, just like you would in paper 2. Probably paper 2, your teacher's done loads of practice with you, and you're really, really used to the idea that you must apply your knowledge to the scenario. You must contextualize your strength, your weakness, whatever else it is. Please don't forget to do that for paper 1 as well. It's the exact same skill when the research methods just kind of pop up on there.
Great. What a great session. Lots of expertise shared there. Thank you both. If we haven't managed to answer your question, or you've got more, or you start revising and things come to you, don't stop. Get in touch with us on Instagram. We're at Tutor2Psych. You can DM us, or we've got a little comment section there where you can put your questions in. One of us will get back to you as soon as possible. You can watch this session. We've gone through so much. Go back, watch it, go for the bits that you're struggling with. Look at our back catalogue on our YouTube channel. And we're going to be back next week. We've got Monday the 20th for approaches, and then we're back on the Tuesday for a double session where we're going to target biopsych, and we're going to hold another one of these exam clinics but for paper 2. So until then, you've got time. Prioritise what would make you cry on the exam. That's always my final top tip. Prioritise that. Don't just sit in your comfy zone. Go for what you know is going to be your struggled area. But thank you very much. We wish you all the best of luck for Friday. We're still here to help you. Just get in touch on Instagram, and very good luck to you all. Goodbye, everybody.
Good luck, guys.
Bye.
Bye.